Hello, hello, and welcome to the first episode of Coffee with Thorben in 2021. I hope you had great holidays and that you grabbed your beverage of choice. In this case, it's just a black coffee. And that you brought a few questions for the Q&A section that we will do at the end of today's stream. So from now on, I thought we take a little bit of a different approach to the streams that we did in the past. In the past, we either had a guest on the stream, and we might have that in the future again, or we did a Q&A session. From now on, I thought, okay, let's split the stream up into multiple parts, and we will start with a small part in which we learn something new, in which we dive into a specific topic, which today will be the topic of migrating your database. There I will show you the different options that you have and compare what you can do with Hibernate with the stuff that you can do with Flyway and Liquibase, for example, and why you should add another framework to your application to actually implement the database migration process. Then I will talk about the question of the week, which will be a recurring element of these streams where I pick a question that I answered on one of the days before the stream, either on the blog, the YouTube channel, or maybe on Stack Overflow, that I thought is interesting. And this week, it's about using the criteria API from JPA as part of a Spring Data JPA repository to implement a query that uses a subselect. So let's see how that goes, and then we end the whole thing with a Q&A segment. Yeah, as I said, this is a new structure of the stream. When you watched the stream last year, then you see that I changed a few other things around here. So if you have any feedback, please post them in the chat. I would love to get your opinion on that. And yeah, let's dive into today's first topic, which is the migration of databases. Well, that's something that all of us sooner or later need to do in a project. I mean, in the beginning, we need to set up the database. We often do that based on entity mappings, or we reuse a database schema that we got from our DBAs, or that was already there because we are integrating with a legacy database. So when we start the project, we either need to set up this initial database, or we will need to migrate the database with one of the upcoming releases. And there the question is, how do we actually do that? And which options do we have there? Let me quickly switch to my browser and show you an article that I wrote about JPA's feature set that you can use to create and update your database. So you can see it here. The JPA specification added in version 2.1 a bunch of configuration parameters that you can use to tell your persistence provider how you should, or how it should generate and update the database. There is, of course, the parameter that probably all of you have already heard about, and that is this schema generation database action, which allows you to generate your database based on the entity mappings. And I know that sounds like an amazing feature in the beginning, but it has a bunch of downsides. First of all, the database is something that is performance critical, and that's especially the case for the schema, which means the table definition, the indexes, and all these kind of things. And there are good reasons why database vendors put a lot of effort into performance optimization, and why most teams have DBAs that make sure that database actually performs well. And well, for them, it's basically the same as it is for us as a Java developer. We would never want to deploy some generated code where some user who has just mediocre knowledge about our programming language just clicked a few things and then exported Java code and run it in production, right? I mean, I wouldn't want to run that in production. And the same is true for the DBAs. They don't like this approach because, well, it's not perfect. And nobody really knows what will happen there, especially not in the DBA team. So please be very careful about using this parameter here. It's meant to be used for smaller test databases, for rapid prototyping, or to create the first actual database that you use if you're writing a very small, maybe in-house application. What's more useful is this part here, the JavaX persistence schema generation scripts action, because with that you can tell your persistence provider, for example Hibernate, that it shall generate SQL scripts based on the entity mappings. And there's a huge difference between this and the other one. The first one, the database action, that one automatically executes all these operations. So there you already have the database, or you set it up at startup. This one down here is something that you can use during development to generate the SQL scripts, which then get reviewed by you or the DBAs, and then later on manually executed. So this would be closer to what we often see with code generation tools in the Java world or in other programming languages, where you use a tool to generate all the stupid stuff, and then you do the actual thinking and the fine-tuning and tweaking and making sure that it really works afterwards based on the stuff that was generated. And that is something that you can do with the schema generation scripts action parameter. Because, well, let's be honest, yes, DBAs want to have control over the scripts that get executed to create a database schema or to migrate it. And I totally get that. They are responsible for that, and there are a lot of things that can go wrong. But do you know any DBA who wants to create the stupid table definition of an author table, who has an ID column, a first name, a last name, and a date of birth? Probably not, right? So if you can provide these kind of scripts to your DBA and then tell them, look, we already did all the basic stuff here. Please take a look at it, review it, and make sure that it's actually a good and performant way to define the database tables, and that nothing is missing there, then they will probably be very happy to use it. So next few things that might be interesting are the SQL load script source, the create script source, and the drop script source. So if you have an SQL database script that defines your table structure, then you can use this create script source parameter to tell your persistence provider where it can find the SQL script, and then having it executes it during startup. Instead of generating the create table statements based on the entities, it then uses the create table statements that are part of the file that you reference here. And well, this is still not what you need to actually migrate or update your database, but it's way better than using entity mapping information to create the script. But drop script is the reverse operation, there you can drop it. And SQL load script source is pretty interesting because you can use it to provide an SQL script that contains test data, for example, where you execute insert statements during application startup to pre-fill your database with configuration data, for example. And you can then, and I'll show that down here, for example, use these parameters to set up a typical test database. So here you can see a typical persistence XML file, and I use the load script, SQL load script source to import the data that's defined in the data SQL file. That's something you could do for local test setups or for standalone applications. But you can see it's pretty limited. Hibernate will execute this all the time when you start up the application. So you need to be really careful on what kind of stuff you put in there. The other approach that I will show you in a minute is way more powerful. And then you have the option I want to show you down here, using the scripts action. So here we create the create SQL file and the drop SQL file, which is a shortcut to actually get SQL scripts with your table definitions based on your entity mappings. Okay, so I said that the schema generation features of Hibernate are limited and that you should do something else instead. So what should you do? The thing you should do is version-based database migration. And the idea there is that you migrate and extend and change your database alongside the changes that you apply to your Java code. So that means you version the database in the same way you version your Java code. And whenever you roll out the Java update, the update of your Java code, you also roll up the update of your database. And there are two ways you can easily do that. One is you use the library Liquibase, and the other one is Flyway. Let me switch to the IDE so that we can take a closer look at that. So I added the Flyway dependencies to my project, and after you did that, you can then use something like this. If you're using plain Java with Spring Boot, you have a nice integration that does that automatically for you, to run a Flyway database migration for this data source. So what does Flyway? Flyway then executes all the migrations that are either in the configured folder or in the default path, which is this DB migration folder. And you can see here that I provided a file called v1__create database.sql. And there we have a few statements: a create table, a create sequence. And if we run this, then we can see in the log that we used Flyway. It validated 2 migration steps and then migrated the schema to version 1, create database, which is the one here. You see version 1__, and create database SQL is the text that you can see here. And extract author, that is the second migration step that I added afterwards, using the Java callbacks that Flyway supports. But that isn't topic of this part right here. So let's focus on the script-based migration first. So why did Flyway know that it has to execute this script here and the other one? And how did Flyway know if the database is new or if it was already in version 5, for example, and these migration steps here were totally unnecessary? Well, it knows that based on the, where is it? Here. Based on a few information in the database. So here we have a Flyway schema history. And in this table, you can see that Flyway documents all the migration steps that it did. And each and every time you start up your application and you tell Flyway to check and run a database update, Flyway then executes the, checks this database table. Hold on for a second. Flyway checks the database table here and then executes the SQL statements that are not referenced down here. So Flyway found, okay, we have version 1 and version 2. When we executed the migration while starting up the application, Flyway checked, didn't find a Flyway schema history table, and then said, okay, then I need to execute all the update statements. Started with the version 1 and then executed version 2. And you can see here that Flyway updated the database. Okay, let's get back into the IDE. So here you can see the update script again. So Flyway parses all the files in the folder that you referenced, or the default folder, determines the version number, and then finds all the files that need to be executed. And it expects that these are SQL files, which has the benefit that your DBAs can easily read, check, and update these files themselves, and you can easily deploy them. But it has the and you can use all database-specific features without any need that Flyway supports any of them. But it has the downside that if you're supporting multiple database systems, that you then need to support each and every one of them with your own SQL file. Liquibase takes a different approach. So Liquibase basically does the same, right? So you can use it to implement version-based database migration. You can define your update steps in multiple files, but it doesn't use SQL statements. It uses its own SQL, its own XML format. So you need a database changelog, which then references the database changelog files for each version. And you can see one here, and here you can see that you define change sets. So in each and every change set, you define, well, a set of changes. So in this case, I create a sequence called Hibernate sequence. I create a database table with the name author and first name, last name, version, and ID columns. And set later, I add a table book to the mix. I add primary keys, and so on. You can see here that this is a format that should look relatively familiar if you're familiar with SQL, but that provides a certain level of abstraction. So what Liquibase then does is, when you run the test case or start up your application that uses Liquibase, then it basically does the same. It gets a list of all the changelogs, determines which changes need to be applied, and then applies all the change sets that are defined in the XML files. So when we now look at the test Liquibase table, then we can see here that Liquibase generated or created our author, book, and book author table. And you can see here that we now have a changelog table in which we can see all the changelogs that got executed by Liquibase. So Liquibase here does some form of bookkeeping to actually be able to identify all the changes it already performed and to find the ones that are still necessary. Yeah, These were the two basic approaches that you have when you want to implement your database migration. You can use the JPA or Hibernate features, which I don't recommend, at least not for longer ongoing maintenance of your database. Or you can use a version-based database migration approach that is versioning your database in the same cadence as you version your Java code, and then migrates your database with each software update that you deploy. And two ways to implement that are Flyway and Liquibase. They are very similar from the feature set. Both of them are more than solid and production ready. I used both of them in various projects. I suggest you just pick the one that you feel a little bit more comfortable with. Both, as I said, both of them work really well. Let me quickly check if there are any questions about this part. Yeah, hello everyone, and thanks for all the kind words in the chat. So Mohammed asked if there's support for materialized views. Yes, you can create materialized views if they are supported by your database. The easiest way to use all the features supported by your database would be Flyway, because they are using standard SQL scripts. So as long as your database understands the SQL statements that you put into your migration scripts, everything is good. But I'm very sure that Liquibase as well supports materialized views in their update scripts. So yes, you can do that. Alexander wrote that Liquibase also allows to write SQL scripts like Flyway. It doesn't stick to XML format only. Yeah, but as far as I know, the recommended approach with Liquibase would be to use the XML format. Then Thorsten asked if there are any tools that I recommend for data modeling. No, in general, not. Well, I'm usually joining a project as a consultant, and I'm helping them to improve their project or to set up a new one and implement a complex persistence layer. And because of that, we usually use the tools that they already have. So yeah, there's no specific data modeling tool that that I would recommend. I usually use what is there. Ankit asks, which one is easy to use, Flyway or Liquibase? I personally think Flyway is a little bit easier because it uses plain SQL scripts. With the downside or limitation that you need multiple SQL scripts if you need to support multiple databases. But if that's not an issue, then I personally prefer Flyway. Okay. Then let's do a quick weekly recap. Another element that I want to add to this stream. I want to quickly summarize what kind of new content you can find on my YouTube channel, on the blog, and maybe follow up on some recent events or something. So this week I posted a recap post for this year. And I want to quickly summarize the plans for this year. So if you like, you can take a look at the recap of last year. There were a few things that were really great last year, even though we had a pandemic or still have one. So yeah, what's planned for this year? I want to do more online speaking because, to be realistic, traveling will be an issue for a while. And I enjoy staying at home. Well, at least as long as I can go out and spend my free time somewhere. But staying at home, having breakfast and dinner with family is pretty nice. And with this virtual jug tour and the conferences, I hope that I can still be able to speak in front of more people than I did last year, and catch up onto the number of talks I gave in 2019, for example. So yeah, I already talked with a few jugs about speaking at their events. I currently have, I think it's 4 talks already scheduled, and I'm talking with a handful of other jugs. If you're organizing a Java user group or another Java event, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to speak there as well. Then we will have online workshops this year. So that is basically the same as an open classroom workshop that you know from conferences. The main difference is we're meeting online. I did that last year. It worked really, really well. Zoom has great features to collaborate and to host an interactive event. So you can see the dates here. And where then we would do weekly live streams like the one that we do right now. And then I'm working on a video course, or to be more precise, I'm about to start working on one because I wanted to get your opinion first. So if you're on my mailing list, which I think you should, then you already got an email from me asking about which kind of course you would prefer. If you have a minute now while listening to me rambling about the stuff that I'm planning for this year, then please let me know in the chat if you would prefer an online course about Spring Data JPA or one about Hibernate Reactive. I think both topics are really interesting. Spring Data JPA is a topic I've been asked to do a course about for a few years now, so I think it's more than about time to actually do that. And Hibernate Reactive is a really new, interesting, new framework provided by the Hibernate team that applies the Hibernate ORM mapping capabilities and query capabilities to the reactive stack. So it's an adaptation of Hibernate ORM to reactive. Also really interesting. I'm just wondering how many of you are already interested in a reactive framework and would like to get a course about it. So yeah, let me know in the chat what you think. And then the second thing that I published this week was about the criteria API. So Hibernate has had a criteria API for years, a proprietary one. And then we got a new version of JPA with JPA's criteria API. And then we had 2 competing APIs within Hibernate. And the Hibernate team kept both of them for a while. Then they deprecated their own Hibernate API, criteria API. I think it was in version 5 or one of the late 4.4 versions. It definitely has been a while, which means a few years, that this API has been deprecated. And with Hibernate 6, the proprietary API will be removed. The main reason for that is why the Hibernate team had to put in a lot of work to consolidate how they create SQA statements within Hibernate and to improve the whole process. And they said, well, it doesn't make a lot of sense to migrate an old already deprecated API. So they decided to remove it in Hibernate 6. And well, in this week's video, I explain how you can migrate from Hibernate's proprietary API to the JPA criteria API, which is something that requires quite some work, yes, but which isn't too complex to do. I did that in 2 or 3 customer projects. It was a little bit annoying, but in general, it's something that you can do within a reasonably amount of effort, and the complexity of this migration in general is relatively low. Okay. Any questions about the stuff that I published this week? So from now on, if you're reading a blog post that I published that week, or if you watched that week's video and you have any questions about it, then joining the live streams on Friday and asking them in this part of the stream would be an amazing fit. Okay, so then let's get to the question of the week. The question of the week is related to the video in some ways. And I got an interesting question via Twitter. So, who was it? Jules pinged me on Twitter and linked to the question here on Stack Overflow and asked me if I could take a look at it. And that is a rather interesting one. So what they are doing is they use Spring Data JPA repositories, and they use the JPA criteria API to implement dynamic queries based on information provided at runtime. So they have this method here, and based on the input parameter that get provided to the findAll method, the query is slightly different, right? So if they provide certification status type ID and with a value greater than 0, then they want to use this subselect down here to get the information from the database. So here we have two things that I would like to get into. The first one is, how do you actually define a subselect using JPA's criteria API? And the second one is, how do you use it with the Spring Data Spring Data JPA API? So let's get into the IDE. So here we have a criteria query that I built that is very close to the API that, or the query that you saw on that Stack Overflow question. So what do? We get a criteria builder, because well, that's what we need to do every time we want to create a criteria query. Then we get a create a criteria query for the certification status entity, define a from clause, define a select clause. That's the typical stuff, and that's what you can see here. So we are selecting from the certification status, and now we need to do this part here. ID in select max ID from certification status, group by certification ID. So how do we do that? We take the criteria query that we defined before and call the subquery method on it. And in this case, I want to create a subquery that returns a long, because we wanted to compare the ID of the certification status with the returned list of certification status ID values returned by that query. So we create the subquery and we get a subquery interface back, and that one is very similar to the criteria query interface that you already know. So we can call the from method to create the from clause. We use the criteria builder to do a select max value, and then we group the whole thing by the ID of the certification. And then comes another interesting part, and that's the definition of the where clause of the outer query. So we wanted to compare the ID of the certification that we select out here with the result of the subquery. And this approach usually gets a few surprised looks, because where we are not using the criteria builder to build the in clause, but here we are starting on the ID attribute of the root entity, and then we call the in method with the subquery. So let's quickly run this test and take a look at the SQL statement that we are executing. And here you can see now the SQL statement. So we are selecting everything from the certification status where the ID is in this subselect. And that is exactly what we wanted to do here. So we wanted to get everything from the certification status and compare that the ID is one of the max IDs selected by this subselect. Okay, so we solved the part about how do we define that in using the criteria API. The next question is how do we provide that to how do we use that with Spring Data JPA? And you can see that up here. So here we have a find all method, and the certification repository provides a find all method that gets the root, and for that we define this part down here, and we get the root, the criteria query, and the criteria builder. And then down here we just add a few predicates to the list. So what we now need to do is we just need to provide a set of predicates for the query, and that can easily be done by using this approach. Oh, it's easier is taking a look at the updated version here. So we define the joins on the root and create the subquery, and then add the predicates down here. So as you can see, it's a little bit less work to do in the Spring Data JPA case, and compared to the plain JPA approach where you would need to do all of this, where is it? There, all of this boilerplate code here to set up a criteria builder, to create a query, to actually execute the query down here, and so on. Okay, yeah, that was the question of the week. I hope you enjoyed it and found it helpful. Let's now dive into the Ask Me Anything part, and I already see a few questions in the chat. We have about 20 minutes left to go, so if you have any questions, post them in the chat. I need to leave at 4 p.m., which is in 22 minutes. Until then, I'm more than happy to answer your questions. So let's dive right in and see what we have here. Hi, Zaukari. Can you give some in-depth details about second level cache, like at which point we need to clear cache? That's an interesting question. Well, you shouldn't need to clear the cache in general. Well, at least not as long as you perform all your changing operations using JPA or Hibernate. So how does the second level cache work? The second level cache is a session independent cache in which Hibernate stores all the entities that are defined for caching. So when you annotate your entity with @cacheable and set your shared cache mode to enable selected, then Hibernate caches the entities that are defined for caching. So you then can read or insert or update these entities, and Hibernate will automatically update the second level cache with them. So whenever you read a new entity that's marked for second level caching and that's not part of the second level cache, Hibernate will add it to the cache. whenever you change one of these entities, they will be automatically added. So as long as you don't have a second process which doesn't use Hibernate and which directly changes the database, the elements in the second level cache should always be up to date. So there is no reason to clear the cache. What you need to do is you need to configure your second level cache. You need to make sure that you define the size, the maximum size of your cache, and depending on the cache implementation that you use, you have different options to do that. You can often either define the amount of memory that you want to use for the cache, or you can define the number of objects that can be stored in the cache. And that is the only way to then, or the most common way to remove objects from the cache. But you define the maximum size of the cache, and then as soon as you reach the upper limit, your cache implementation will use the configured algorithm to clean up the cache, to remove old objects, and to make sure that everything is cleaned up correctly. And then Saukari posted another follow-up question: how data is stored in second level cache, list or map? Well, that totally depends on the cache implementation. But in general, caches are hash maps, but very, very fancy and advanced implementations of hash maps. But the general idea is basically a hash map. So with Hibernate or any other JPA implementation, if you add an element to the cache, it's usually stored in its dehydrated form, and the key of the cache entry is the class name and the primary key value as a combination. And then you have an array of attribute values that are stored in the cache. And whenever you get an entity from the cache, which is whenever you either traverse an association or call an entity manager find method, Hibernate gets these attribute values from the cache, instantiates a new entity object, fills it with all these values, and then hands it out to you. Okay, what else can we find here in the cache? Okay, there seems to be quite some interest for the Hibernate reactive version. That's interesting. Thanks for the feedback. So is there a possibility generating and using enums or constants for the column names used in get? Yes, there is. Let me get into the IDE. So I'm sure I have an example here. So here we used all the string representations. And I think that is what, who was it? What Thorsten asked about. You asked about these strings here, right, Thorsten? So what you can do there is you can use the JPA meta model. The JPA meta model is something that's defined by the JPA specification, and each and every JPA implementation needs to provide a generator for it. So with Hibernate, you just add a dependency to Hibernate JPA model again to your build process, and then you, where is it? There. When you then run your build next time, then Hibernate will generate these classes for you. So it will generate a static Java class for each and every entity class that you have in your project. And it's stored in the same package. It has the same name as the entity with an added underscore at the end. And if we close this, you can see that we have here a set of static attributes, one for each entity attribute, and we can reference use these to implement our criteria query and to reference these attributes in the code, or you can get the string values of the attribute names down here. I recommend using this approach because it also provides additional type information. So Hibernate or the Java compiler can see that the first name attribute is then of type string, or as a book, or long. So how do we use that in the test? Well, we can see that here. So here I'm creating a criteria builder that is supposed to, a criteria query that's supposed to define a query that returns the title and the publishing date of books. So create a tuple query, I define the root clause, and down here you can see how I used the JPA meta model. So I reference the publishing date of the attribute of the book entity by using the book underscore class and then referencing the publishing date, and do the same with the title. The interesting thing here is, because these classes are generated, we can be sure that there's an attribute for each and every attribute of our entity class. So you can see the entity class here. It has ID, version, title, publishing date, publisher, and authors as attributes. And if we take a look at the code completion here, you can see that we have the static strings up here for each attribute, and down here the singular and plural or singular and set attributes for all the attributes of our entity. And that enables us to write the query in a type-safe and easy way. And if you refactor the entity and change the name of title to whatever, to name, then Hibernate will regenerate the book underscore class during the next build process, change the name of the attribute from title to name, and these parts here will cause a compiler error because book underscore dot title is no longer known, and you can easily find all the places in your code that you need to adjust due to the refactoring that you did on your entity. And I know that that's not the kind of tooling that we would love to have. It would be way better and more comfortable if all these places in our Java code would be adjusted automatically when we refactor the book. But well, that's currently just not an option. And this approach here is way better than what we get with the string-based references, because here we at least get a compiler error. And after we fixed all the compiler errors, which are really easy to find because it doesn't compile, we know that we adjusted all the places that we need to change. In contrast to using string references, which seem to work perfectly fine until we actually execute that part of the code. And Hibernate tells us that this is not a known entity attribute. Okay, let's see. The power user. Is there any way to DTO projection Spring Data JPA without mentioning the fully qualified class name with package in the query? Yes, there is. You can simply use the type of your DTO object as the return type of your derived query. Spring Data JPA then automatically generates that. Let me quickly see. I have an article about that, I'm sure. Let me see if I find it. Let's see if there's something in here. So these are entities. It's either this or one of my other articles. If it's not this, then yeah, no, it's not this one. It's probably this one. Yeah. So here we have a DTO class, and we need a constructor that takes all the attribute values when using JPA. And we then have something like this. And that's probably what the power user wrote about in his query. We have the fully qualified class name here. And we tell Hibernate how to instantiate the constructor. And that's something that you can, of course, do. But you can also use this approach here, where you just provide the DTO class. And that works as long as your DTO class has exactly one constructor and all the parameter names match the names of your attributes of the entity class. Then Spring generates all the basic stuff. And you even don't need a DTO class. You could also just define an interface like I do down here. And if then that interface defines getter methods, get first name, get last name. Then the name of that method, of that getter method of the interface, then needs to be identical to the name of the getter method on the entity class. And then Spring Data maps that stuff automatically as well. So these are the two easiest approaches. I paste the link to the article in the chat. Spring Data projections. You can dive a little bit deeper into that. As you can see, I've shown and explained a few more things here, including open and closed projections and dynamic projections. And yeah, you can take a closer look at that in the article. Mohammed asks, can you recommend a way to measure ORM performance with Spring? Well, what you can do is switch to the IDE. What you can do is you can activate Hibernate statistics. Should have an example for that here. Hibernate. Let's see, this one probably activates the statistics. No, there. Yeah, so what you can do is you can set the property Hibernate.generate statistics to true, and then Hibernate logs out. Now I broke my test system. Great. Hibernate writes out a log message that shows you a few information about the operations it performed. So let's take a look at the test case that we used before. Yeah, this one works. So Hibernate statistics shows you this block here with the number of JDBC statements executed, how long that took, how long partial flushes and flushes took, and stuff like that. So here you get an overview about how long did your database related operations actually take. what kind of operations did you perform, and this gives you a first indication of what you should take a closer look at. Another thing you can do is you can take a look at my perf tester tool, which automates a huge part of that. So what perf tester does is perf tester monitors the statistics, collects its own statistics as part of Hibernate, and then analyzes them and tells you about performance issues in your code. You can find it at thorbenjansen.com/perf-tester. Okay, probably the final question. Mohammed wrote, I need the ability to store dynamic columns in a table, so I followed the EFA model. Any other suggestions and how to persist it, please? Yeah, you either use the EFA approach, or what you could also do is you could actually store a JSON document in your relational database in one column. That totally depends on what you need to do with these information. Do you need to use them in complex queries? Do you need a lot of read and write operations on them, or is it just a store once operation? Yeah, and then how complex is your whole model? An EFA-based approach can get relatively slow rather quickly if you are reading and or writing a huge number of values. Working with a JSON document well, it can be the better approach. That totally then depends on the DBMS that you are using and its support for JSON data structures. With Postgres, for example, it works really well, and you can even perform queries based on the content of the JSON document. Has a little bit of weird SQL syntax, but it works reasonably well. Okay, final question from the power user. There's some rule on how many connection pool needs to be set for Hikari if a server receives 200 concurrent requests per second. I'm using login that is based on DB session, which is causing issue. Well, the power user there, that question is hard to answer. That totally depends on the number of how long a session actually takes. So if you have 200 concurrent requests per second and your average duration of a second is 10 milliseconds, then then you could just calculate how many of these sessions you can run within one session and then calculate it based on that. So there you could probably, well, if a session takes about 2 milliseconds, then you probably have probably good with 10 to 20 sessions in your connection pool, connections in your connection pool. But as I said, that totally depends on how long does a session take, how evenly distributed are your requests, what are the peak numbers, what happens if a session, if a connection isn't available, how long can you wait for another connection, and yeah, based on that. So the power user now wrote, each query request takes me 30 milliseconds max in response from remote database server. And it's just one query. Well, then you can well, how would you calculate it? You would then calculate how many of your sessions fit into 1 second, and then you calculate how many connections would you need to actually serve 200 sessions within 1 second, and then I would add a bunch of connections on top, just to be sure that you always have more than enough connections available. Okay, well, then I would say we reached the end of today's stream. Thanks so much, everyone, for attending and all the questions. I really enjoyed it. I hope you liked it as well. Yeah, from now on, I will go live with this or a pretty similar format each and every Friday at 3 p.m. CET. Yeah, hope to see you next week again. On next Tuesday, you will get a new blog post on thorbenjanssen.com where I take a look at batch jobs and how you can implement them with JPA and Hibernate. And you will get another video on next Thursday here on the YouTube channel as well. And then a live stream next Friday. Okay, thanks again. Have a great weekend and see you next week. Bye.